The Battle of Pulo was a minor naval engagement of the Napoleonic Wars, fought on 14 February 1804, in which a large convoy of Honourable East India Company East Indiamen, well-armed merchant ships, intimidated, drove off and chased a powerful French naval squadron. Although the French force was much stronger than the British convoy, Commodore Nathaniel Dance's aggressive tactics persuaded Contra-Admiral Charles Alexander de Randlinois to retire after only a brief exchange of shot. Dance then chased the French warships until his convoy was out of danger, whereupon he resumed his passage towards British India. Linois later claimed that the unescorted British merchant fleet was defended by 8 ships of the line, a claim criticised by contemporary officers and later historians. The battle occurred during an extended commerce raiding operation by a French squadron led by Linois in the ship of the line Marengo. Linois had sailed to the Indian Ocean in 1803 before the declaration of war, under orders to install garrisons in the French and Dutch colonies in the region and to prey on lightly defended British merchant shipping. One of the richest and most significant targets was the China fleet, an annual convoy of East Indiamen from China and other Far Eastern ports that carried millions of pounds worth of trade goods. Although these large vessels were accompanied by numerous smaller merchant ships, news of the outbreak of war had only just arrived in the Pacific, and the only warship available to defend the fleet was the small HEIC-armed brig, Ganges. Dutch informants notified Linois of the fleet's destination and date of departure from Canton while he was anchored at Batavia on Java, and he sailed in search of the convoy on 28 December 1803, eventually discovering it in early February. Although no warships protected the convoy, Commodore Dance knew that lookouts could, from a distance, mistake a large East Indiaman for a ship of the line. He raised flags that indicated that his fleet included part of the Royal Navy squadron operating in the Indian Ocean at the time and formed into a line of battle. Although Linois's ships were clearly superior, the British reaction unnerved him and he quickly broke off combat. Dance continued his ruse, pursuing Linois for 2 hours until the body of the convoy was safe. King George III knighted Dance for his courage in various mercantile and patriotic organizations awarded him large sums of money, while both Linois's own officers and the Emperor Napoleon personally castigated the French admiral for his failure to press the attack against a weaker and extremely valuable enemy. Although he remained in command of the squadron for another 2 years and had some minor success against undefended merchant ships, he suffered a string of defeats and inconclusive engagements against weaker British naval forces. Ironically, Linois was captured at the action of 13 March 1806 by a numerically superior British battle squadron that he mistook for a merchant convoy. Background: during the Napoleonic Wars, the British economy depended on its ability to trade with the British Empire, particularly the valuable colonies in British India. The intercontinental trade was conducted by the governors of India, the Honourable East India Company, using their fleet of large, well-armed merchant vessels known as East Indiamen. These ships were of between 500 and 1,200 nominal tons burden and could carry up to 36 guns for defence against pirates, privateers and small warships. They were not, however, capable under normal circumstances of fighting off an enemy frigate or ship of the line. Their guns were usually of inferior design, and their crew smaller and less well-trained than those on a naval ship. The East Indiamen sought to ensure the safety of their cargo and passengers, not defeat enemy warships in battle. Despite these disadvantages, the size of East Indiamen meant that from a distance they appeared quite similar to a small ship of the line, a deception usually augmented by paintwork and dummy cannon. At the Bali Strait incident of 28 January 1797, an unescorted convoy of East Indiamen had used this similarity to intimidate a powerful French frigate squadron into withdrawing without a fight. In February 1799, an attack by a combined French-Spanish squadron on the assembled convoy at Macau was driven off in the Macau incident without combat by the small Royal Navy escort squadron. The East Indiamen would gather at ports in India and the Far East and from there set out for Britain in large convoys, often carrying millions of pounds worth of trade goods. The journey would usually take 6 months and the ships would subsequently return carrying troops and passengers to augment the British forces stationed in India. Country ships, smaller merchant vessels chartered for local trade, sometimes independently from the HEIC, would often join the convoys to protect their ships from the depredations of pirates. The HEIC also operated its own private navy of small armed vessels. In combination, these ships were an effective deterrent against smaller raiders, but were no match for a professional warship. Understanding the importance of the Indian Ocean trade and seeking to threaten it from the start of the inevitable war, First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte ordered a squadron to sail for India in March 1803. This force was under the command of Contra-Admiral Charles Alexander de Rand-Linois and consisted of the ship of the line Marengo and 3 frigates. Linois operated from the island base of Ile-de-France with orders to attack British shipping once war had begun. Sailing initially to Pondicherry in India, Linois had a close encounter with a British squadron under Rear Admiral Peter Rainier during July, but was at Ile-de-France in August when news arrived that the Napoleonic Wars had started on the 16th of May. Determined to fortify the French raiding bases in the region, Linois landed troops and supplies at Arequipe, Union and Batavia. During the operation he dispatched the frigate Atalante to Muscat, captured numerous individual country ships, and burned the British trading post of Bencoolen. On the 10th of December he anchored at Batavia for the winter. Shortly thereafter, informants passed to Batavia the composition and date of departure of the British China fleet, leading Linois to set out to intercept it. On the 28th of December, Linois's squadron, consisting of Marengo, frigates Bellepool and Saint-Malante, the corvette Berceau and the Dutch brig Aventurier, departed Batavia. The ships carried 6 months' worth of provisions as Linois had anticipated an extended patrol in the approaches to the Strait of Malacca in the South China Sea. The China fleet was a large annual British merchant convoy that gathered at Canton in the Pearl River during the winter before sailing for Britain via India. As the convoy passed through the East Indies, it was joined by vessels sailing from other European ports in the region on the route to India, until it often numbered dozens of ships. The 1804 fleet departed in late January, and by the time it reached the approaches to the Strait of Malacca it had swelled to include 16 East Indiamen, 11 country ships, a Portuguese merchant ship from Macau and a vessel from Botany Bay in New South Wales. Although the HEIC had provided the small, armed brig Ganges as an escort, this vessel could only dissuade pirates. It could not hope to compete with a French warship. There was no military escort. News of the outbreak of war had reached Canton before reinforcements had arrived from the squadron in India. Spies based in Canton had passed the composition and date of departure of the China fleet to Linois in Batavia, but the Dutch informants at Canton had also passed on false reports that Royal Navy warships were accompanying the convoy, reports that may have been deliberately placed by British authorities. The convoy was an immensely valuable prize, its cargo of tea, silk and porcelain valued at over £8 million in contemporary values. Also on board were 80 Chinese plants ordered by Sir Joseph Banks for the Royal Gardens and carried in a specially designed plant room. The HEIC Select Committee in Canton had been very concerned for the safety of the unescorted convoy, and had debated delaying its departure. The various captains had been consulted, including Henry Meriton, who in his ship Exeter had captured a frigate during the action of 4 August 1800, a disastrous French attack on a convoy of East Indiamen off Brazil. Meriton advised that the convoy was powerful enough in both appearance and reality to dissuade any attack. He was opposed by John Farquharson of Alfred, who considered that the crews of East Indiamen were so badly trained that they would be unable to mutually defend one another if faced with a determined enemy. Eventually the committee decided that it could delay the convoy no longer and awarded command to the most experienced captain, Commodore Nathaniel Dance, an officer with over 45 years' service at sea in the East Indiaman on Earl Camden. Battle at 800 on 14 February 1804, with the island of Pulo within sight to the southwest near the eastern entrance to the Straits of Malacca. The Indiaman Royal George raised a signal describing 3 sail approaching the convoy from the direction of the island. This was Linois's squadron, which had been cruising in the area for the previous month in anticipation of the convoy's arrival. Dance ordered the brig Ganges and the Indiaman Alfred, Royal George, Bombay Castle and hoped to approach the strange vessels and investigate, rapidly discovering that they were enemy warships. By 1300, Dance had readied his guns and reformed his convoy, with the large Indiaman formed up in line of battle to receive the French attack as if they were warships. During the late afternoon, Linois's squadron fell in behind the slow line of merchant ships and Dance expected an immediate attack. But Linois was cautious and merely observed the convoy, preferring to wait until the following morning before engaging the enemy. Dance made use of the delay to gather the smaller country ships on the opposite side of his line from the French, the brig Ganges shepherding them into position and collecting volunteers from their crews to augment the sailors on board the Indiaman. Linois later excused his delay in attacking the merchant convoy by citing the need for caution. If the bold front put on by the enemy in the daytime had been intended as a ruse to conceal his weakness, he would have profited by the darkness of the night to endeavor to conceal his escape, and in that case should have taken advantage of his maneuvers. But I soon became convinced that this security was not feigned. 3 of his ships constantly kept their lights up, and the fleet continued to lie to, in order of battle, throughout the night. This position facilitated my gaining the wind, and enabled me to observe the enemy closely. Linois, quoted in translation in William James' The Naval History of Great Britain during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Volume 3, 1827. At dawn on 15 February, both the British and French forces raised their colours. Dance hoped to persuade Linois that his ships included some fully armed warships, and he therefore ordered the brig Ganges and the 4 lead ships to hoist blue ensigns, while the rest of the convoy raised red ensigns, by the system of national flags then in use in British ships. This implied that the ships with blue ensigns were warships attached to the squadron of Admiral Rainier, while the others were merchant ships under their protection. Dance was unknowingly assisted by the information that had reached Linois at Batavia, which claimed that there were 23 merchant ships and a brig in the convoy. Dance had collected 6 additional ships during his journey, and the identity of these were unknown to the French, who assumed that at least some of the unidentified vessels must be warships, particularly as several vessels had been recently painted at Canton to resemble ships of the line. At 900, Linois was still only observing the convoy, reluctant to attack until he could be sure of the nature of his opponents. Dance responded to the reprieve by reforming the line of battle into sailing formation to increase his convoy's speed with the intention of reaching the straits ahead of Linois. With the convoy a less intimidating target, Linois began to slowly approach the British ships. By 1300 it was clear that Linois's faster ships were in danger of isolating the rear of the convoy, and Dance ordered his lead ships to tack and come about, so that they would cross in front of the French squadron. The Royal George and the next 4 ships in line, the Indiam and Ganges, Dance's Earl Camden, the Worley and the Alfred, all returned fire. Ganges initially attacking Royal George in error. Captain James Prendergast, in hope, the next in line, was so eager to join the battle that he misjudged his speed and collided with Worley, the ships falling back as their crews worked to separate their rigging. Shots were then exchanged at long range for 43 minutes, neither side inflicting severe damage. Royal George had a sailor named Hugh Watt killed, another man wounded, and suffered some damage to her hull. None of the other British ships or any of the French reported anything worse than superficial damage in the engagement. At 1400, Linois abandoned the action and ordered his squadron to haul away with the wind and sail eastwards, away from the convoy, under all sail. Determined to maintain the pretense of the presence of warships, Dance ordered the ships flying naval ensigns, including his flagship Earl Camden, to chase the French. None of the merchant ships could match the French speed, but an attempt at a chase would hopefully dissuade the French from returning. For 2 hours, Dance's squadron followed Linois, hope coming close to catching Aventurier but ultimately unable to overtake the brig. At 1600, Dance decided to gather his scattered ships and return to his former heading rather than risk attack from other raiders or lose sight of his convoy. In the darkness, by 2000, the entire British convoy had anchored at the entrance to the Straits of Malacca. On the 28th of February, the British ships of the line HMS Sceptre and Albion joined them in the strait and conducted them safely to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Their HMS Plantagenet escorted the convoy to England. 5 whalers and the Carmarthen, Captain Dory, also joined the convoy, with the Black House, from coast of Guinea, joining at sea. The convoy returned to England without further incident. Linois's squadron reached Batavia several days after the action without encountering any British ships. He was there joined by Atalantian, after taking on supplies, made sail for Ile-de-France, arriving on the 2nd of April. The French admiral later attempted to explain his conduct during the engagement. The ships which had tacked rejoined those which were engaging us, and 3 of the engaging ships maneuvered to double our rear, while the remainder of the fleet, crowding sail and bearing up, evinced an intention to surround us. By this maneuver the enemy would have rendered my situation very dangerous. The superiority of his force was ascertained, and I had no longer to deliberate on the part one should take to avoid the consequence of an unequal engagement. Profiting by the smoke, I hauled up to port, and steering east-northeast, I increased by distance from the enemy, who continued the pursuit of the squadron for 3 hours, discharging at it several broadsides. Linois, quoted in translation in William James' The Naval History of Great Britain During the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, Volume 3, 1827.